Back to our top story this morning. The White House is now positioning U.S. warships to help with the evacuation from Sudan. Canada continues to advise Canadian citizens trapped by the fighting there to shelter in place. But in a new message this morning, Foreign Affairs Minister Mélanie Joly says the federal government is exploring options to get Canadians to safety. Other airlifts are underway. This is video from Amman, Jordan. It shows the latest Jordanian airlift out of Sudan. Jordan says it's coordinating evacuations with Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. As we heard earlier in the hour, the European Union's top diplomat says more than 1,000 EU citizens have been flown out. Let's bring you a very particular perspective on all of this. Nicholas Coughlin is with me this morning, Canada's first resident diplomat in Khartoum, the capital of Sudan, going back to 2000 to 2003, and the first resident Canadian ambassador in South Sudan. And in that time and in that term was in charge of an evacuation out of that country when civil war broke out in 2013. He has a lot of expertise to share. So, Mr. Coughlin, welcome. Thank you for being on our program this morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Something has broken overnight. I was just alluding to it. I'm going to bring up the tweet from Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister. The word to Canadian civilians in Sudan over the weekend was evacuations are not possible at this time. But Mélanie Joly, the minister, is saying now we are exploring options regarding departure and the international community assistance in collaboration with like-minded countries for as soon as conditions allow. What would that look like, Mr. Coughlin?
Okay, well, I guess the first challenge is going to be communicating with the Canadian citizens. The internet, from what I'm reading, the internet is very much going up and down. Whether that's a function of the fighting or it's being deliberately taken down is not clear. You really can't get much of an evacuation going if you can't talk to your citizens and give them points of assembly and so on. So I guess that's the first challenge. Okay. Secondly, what would it look like? Well, there are two potential land routes. But they both involve drives of over 800 kilometers. One is to the Egyptian border through the Sahara Desert, and the other to Port Sudan, Port Sudan is relatively quiet, and there would be the option of shipborne evacuations from there. But obviously, we're talking about long drives through the hinterland, the necessity of organizing convoys. Many challenges there. The challenge in Khartoum is the airport. The airport is contested. The airport is incidentally very close to the Canadian embassy. It is downtown. It is contested. The last we know, it's in the hands of the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces. There's been a lot of damage at the airport. There are aircraft strewn all over the place. What the evacuation would look like is basically getting your citizens into a safe perimeter. Probably in this case, a perimeter protected by armed personnel, ensuring the airspace is safe, and then processing your citizens onto aircraft as the aircraft comes in. It would almost certainly involve an awful lot of coordination with our neighbors, in particular the United States. It would probably fall to the US to secure the perimeter, is what I'm guessing. That was the case in Juba, the US in Juba, the only country there with armed people on the ground. And we also made the assessment in Juba that the rebel forces were sufficiently far away. They did not represent a threat.
So as you cite your own experience going back to 2013 when there were evacuations ordered of Canadian civilians there in South Sudan at the time, are there parallels, or how did your experience then sort of influence your view of what's happening now and perhaps your perspective on the challenges ahead?
There are certainly some parallels. A very obvious one is the political military situation. You have, how can I say, two strong men who are fighting it out without any support from the civilian population at all. This is not a civil war. This is two military factions duking it out. It risks becoming a civil war, as did happen in South Sudan, in fact. So that's one immediate parallel. I think the second parallel there was we had for 2 or 3 days, the airport was closed because the rebels were too close. And that was seen as a threat for bringing aircraft in. We had the big difference. The big countries did not leave in Juba. Again, I empathise with Minister Joly, who had to make this decision when it was clear that the UK and the US were leaving. Frankly, what choice did Canada have? We had to take the diplomats out. But that means you're then into the next challenge. To organise an evacuation, you need your diplomats back in, or you need people at a technical level who are able to process papers, issue emergency passports, liaise with Ottawa on incoming flights, and so on. So in other words, you have to have people back in some role.
So I will just jump in. I'm so enthralled by what you're saying there. I was going to ask, with Canadian diplomats out of the country, now working out of a neighboring country in safe circumstances, because obviously there's, as you suggest, their security is paramount, but it does limit, are you suggesting, their response right now at this critical juncture in some way?
It certainly limits. I mean, one thing I should say is, although there are, I believe, nearly 1,600 Canadians registered, I am sure the total of Canadians will actually be much higher than that. For a number of reasons, Canadians tend not to register when they're in their home country. They feel comfortable, they feel at home. Some even feel that Revenue Canada is going to get their hands on them, and they are reluctant to register. So the real numbers will be higher. But the obvious practical challenge I alluded to earlier is, how do you communicate with them from a distance and with the internet down? And also, frankly, a number of people who will not necessarily be on Twitter or Facebook or reading emails. The electricity is going down in Khartoum. Things are getting worse. That's the first problem, is communicating. Even assuming you secure a perimeter, a huge parking lot, if you like, where you're going to process people. That's the number one challenge, is communicating. And secondly, obviously, this is going to be have to be a multinational effort. I would assume the US and the UK would take the lead. They have the aircraft. Frankly, the US has the military personnel in the vicinity. I would assume, on past practice, we will be looking to the US to take the lead on this.
With the naval ships moving in, as I was mentioning, Canada's diplomats certainly not the only to have left in recent days. There has been an exodus of various international diplomats. You mentioned that you don't see this being a civil war now, but has the potential to escalate to that point. Do you think the exodus of diplomats could lead, in fact, is a factor that could lead to an even more brutal turn of events?
I think, unfortunately, the downside, and there are many upsides to leaving. We referred to, obviously, the security of the Canadian diplomats. One of the downsides, it sends a signal of abandonment. There are many people in Sudan who are very critical of the way the international community has handled developments in the last 2 years in Sudan. In particular, they believe the West in general has been too tolerant of the two generals who are now leading this war. So there's a lot of criticism already, and now it's unavoidable. The signal we have sent is a signal of abandoning the country. Even if we then go in and focus on getting our citizens out, that frankly doesn't really change things. We're then just seen as looking after our citizens and nobody else. But that is inevitably a signal that we will send. There's no getting around that.
Okay. Finally, just quickly before I let you go, what should we be watching for in the immediate term? What is most concerning to you right now that you're watching for?
I think on the political front, the risk is, as this fighting goes on, the two warring parties, they're running out of ammunition. It is a fight to the death. They are going to try and suck in the civilian population. They're going to try and manipulate ethnic and tribal groups, their power bases, and they are going to try to draw in their regional sponsors. There are regional countries who are lined up 50-50 with the two sides, notably Egypt lined up with General Burhan, the Sudan Armed Forces, United Arab Emirates lined up with Hemeti on the other side. They will try to draw those powers in with either material support and or diplomatic support. They will also try to convince the Western diplomats that they are the path to democracy and stability. Frankly, neither have any credibility, and we need to find a way ahead that does not involve these two people and that pushes the military way into the background.
Mr. Coughlin, I hope we can have a future conversation. I've enjoyed tremendously as you've shared your experience and expertise. Thank you very much for your time today.
You're most welcome. Bye-bye.
Thank you.